Started. Welcome everyone. My name is Danny Nelms. I'm the CEO at Work Institute. Most of you are fully aware that every year we put out, or not every year, but since 2017, we've been putting out an annual retention report. This year we kind of went back to our original kind of approach. We actually wanted to look back at some of the truths related to employee retention. We explored 10 of those truths in our retention report, and over the last 8 weeks, we have featured in our webcast some of those truths and talked about them. And so today is really kind of a capstone webcast, and I'm thrilled to have my good friend Thomas Barnette joining me today. Thomas and I, it's kind of a cool story in my mind. Thomas and I were college roommates. We decided earlier we're not going to tell you how many years ago that was. But what's been fascinating is that Thomas was an engineer, I was more of an HR person, and somehow our paths have sort of reconnected over the years. And in so many ways, we've had the discussions that we're going to have today. It was just, sitting in a park or over a meal or over a glass of something adult beverage wise. And and so we've talked about these things. And so I thought it'd really be cool to invite Thomas on so we can kind of bring those conversations to you. So Thomas, just give everybody a quick introduction of yourself and a little bit about what you do.
Yes. Good morning, everybody. My name is Thomas Barnette. I am based in Atlanta, Georgia. And I have been, Danny mentioned that I have a degree in industrial engineering. And I think for a lot of people, it's like, well, how do you get from industrial engineering into leadership development and employee engagement as an expert? And Danny will tell you that one of the things that I've always done is I've always just had this passion for people. And it's always been about their purpose and the process to achieve that purpose. And so when you think about industrial engineering, that's part of what I've always done. And I've always had this interest in what makes people do the things that they do from a work and a psychological standpoint. And I've always had just this desire to learn and then teach people what I learn and learn from them. So early on in my career, I had an opportunity to work with leaders in the company that I was hired on with right after Georgia Tech, which is where we met at school. And from that, I just started working more and more in leadership development, developing training programs for leaders and emerging leaders, and figuring out ways to close those gaps between leaders and the teams that they were leading so that they could all be more effective. And it just kept growing and kept growing and kept expanding and evolving from there, which has led me to where I am today.
That's great. And Thomas actually does some work with us in full transparency. So he's been working with some of our valuable clients. And so that's been a kind of a cool way to reconnect as well as to be working together in some client engagement. So it's just cool in my mind.
Yeah, so, I agree.
So what we want to do today is, as we've been going through these truths, we tend to focus on Work Institute data and what the data is telling us and all of those things. And we're not going to ignore the data. But what I value about Thomas's perspective is like, I see him as boots on the ground. I see him as someone that's interacting with the workforce on, a weekly basis, whether it's through his training classes, whether it's through his coaching engagements. But he is really hands-on with a lot of employees, a lot of team members, a lot of companies. And so I kind of look at him as being my eyes and ears on the ground. And so I thought it would be fun to kind of revisit the webcast the things that we've been talking about over these last 8 weeks, kind of consider it a little bit of a capstone webcast, if you will, to kind of revisit them, but talk to, what is this on the ground in terms of how employees are looking at things that are going on today. I wanted to first just kind of revisit and talk about what we see as these emerging characteristics in the workforce. And it's everything from they require flexibility. Flexibility is huge, obviously. A lot of people think that was a result of the pandemic. It actually was happening well before the pandemic, but that kind of fueled that fire, if you will. We talk a lot about not work-life balance, but demanding integration. People want to figure out how to integrate their job and their life together, and that flexibility it goes hand in hand with that integration element. The job itself, they want to play to their strengths. I mean, Thomas talked about it and again, some of these things are connected. He talked about purpose, but purpose really plays into what I'm doing on a day in and day out basis. They want an employee first culture. They want to be important. They want to be seen really as a true asset to the organization, and not just in the traditional sort of flippant way of saying it, but asset in terms of being invested in. Um, Family concerns are becoming more and more of an issue, like how, and again, some of these go back to the integration and the flexibility, but whether it's childcare, whether it's elder care, whether it's just things, whether it's stress, whether it's mental health, well-being, all those things come into that family concern. They want autonomy to do the job, and they want to work with the people that they want to work with. So we have to kind of have these as a backdrop. And Thomas, does anything here sort of jump out at you in terms of and first of all, do you think this describes this current workforce pretty accurately?
Yeah, I think it describes it perfectly because a lot of the conversations, a lot of the meetings that I have been in, a lot of the asks for trainings, and looking at this list, it's perfectly in line with what people honestly have always wanted. You mentioned that the pandemic was kind of a catalyst for it to be looked at a little bit more closely, but people have always wanted this. And part of the conversation has been some of it felt like it was out of reach, and then we were forced into figuring it out. And so we have to look at it and say, as we have different kinds of people coming into the workforce, that need is being brought up again. So looking at this list, I would say it's hard to say which one really stands out. They're all equally important to different people for different reasons.
That's a great point.
And so I can't say one is more or less than the other. When I'm talking to organizations and their leaders and talking to people that are on their teams, it just depends on where they are in their lives. But all of them are important, and I think that's what we have to address.
So I think as we go through the next 35 minutes or 40 minutes or so, actually it's 30 at this point, this is kind of the backdrop we want everybody to be thinking about. Like, how are these truths playing into these characteristics, these preferences and expectations that employees currently have? One of the things that I want to just touch on quickly is obviously a big part of our retention report is why people leave. So that's what we've been reporting on for the last 9 years. With a very comprehensive data set, people are always blown away when I tell them how many exit interviews we've gathered data from. But this being a 5-year trend, I think if I'm remembering the number right, this is coming from like 123,000 exit interviews over that 5-year span. So this is one of the most comprehensive data sets. And, we'll talk about it, but obviously career reasons remain sort of the number one reason people leave. But this health and family category is really growing to some degree, but this is a big issue. But I always point out total rewards, right? It's not the number one thing, and people really mistaken pay as being the driver for retention, and it's really not. And as you can see, over the last 3 years, that actually has been going down. So pay is really not the concern. The other thing we talk about is from our perspective, I think the numbers like 70 some odd % of reasons for leaving are considered preventable. Things that companies can do around career, around the health and family issues or work-life balance, managers, total rewards, job, environment. Those are things that companies can impact and should be impacting from the standpoint of what they can do and how they can intervene. So I think we have to remember that. So just the ones that we're going to kind of talk about, we want to talk about the cost of turnover. We want to talk about managers. We're going to talk about career development. I want to talk with Thomas about just favorable ratings and surveys, but not so much the ratings as much as just how we're holding ourselves accountable. We'll talk a little bit about remote and hybrid work. We're going to talk about some exit and stay data, and we'll touch on those health and family concerns. But I want to start first with not so much that this is a part of the emerging workforce, but we continue to see turnover just being a challenge for organizations. Last year, some 41, 42 million people left their jobs voluntarily. And although that trend has been going down for the last 2 years from a voluntary turnover perspective, as you see in this chart, the cost of turnover is actually increasing. So when you think about the inflationary impacts that we've had over the last few years, not only has it increased wages, but all the things that we have to pay for to replace employees, whether it be background checks or drug screens or credentialing or the training itself, all of those things have gotten more expensive. And so that's one of the things we have to pay attention to. And I wanted to ask you, Thomas, I think our day, we looked at this at least the last couple of years, but like some 35 to 40% of employees will actually leave their job without having a job. What I think that just gives them confidence that their skills are marketable, that they can go out there and they can find another job. Why are they so willing to leave based on the fact that they don't even have a job line in your
Yeah, I think a lot of people, well, it's going to be different for every person. And for a lot of people, their well-being is more important, and so how they feel. I think the word emotional intelligence is extremely important because, as we know, we are in interesting times and where people want to feel good about what they do. So them leaving something that doesn't make them feel good is a lot easier to do, whether they have a backup or not. I think people are also finding a sense of community with others. And so maybe there is a support in whatever way they may need. It could be some financial support, it could be other family members or other friends that they can rely upon until they figure things out. I will say that people are being more resilient. And I say that in terms of making sure that they find something that they align with rather than doing something that they feel they have to do. That doesn't mean it's all people, but for those people who feel like they are in situations where they'd rather leave than stay, and for their well being, that mindset is a part of their decision, knowing that there is some kind of support for them to lean back on. So we've created it. And if you think about your own family or your own kids, you would be there for them if their well being was at risk. And so I think a lot of people are leaning into that and making those decisions that aren't necessarily focused with money or anything else.
Yeah, and Thomas, to me, and I sort of go at it from the company perspective. I'm a big believer in companies have to create the conditions where employees are going to be engaged and stay. And it's like they're doing so little to engage and retain their employees that their employees are saying, "The heck with it, I'm just going to leave, and I'm going to leave without a safety net." So I think you're absolutely right. Those are all the reasons they tell themselves it's okay, but just the frustration alone in terms of saying, I've had enough of this. I'm out of here.
Yeah.
It's really sad. Thomas, one of the things, and I know we talked a little bit about this yesterday, but I didn't ask you this, but the cost of turnover, I still am amazed how few companies actually pay attention to it. And in our truths, we talk about this as being a fiduciary problem. Like it could be a fiduciary breach. I mean, I see companies on a routine basis having millions and millions and millions of dollars of cost of turnover. You obviously also work with HR leaders in your practice and what you're doing.
Mhm.
Why don't companies pay attention to this? Why aren't they tracking these costs of turnover and creating a business case for why they should be doing more to retain their employees?
Yeah. Well, I first want to go back to what you said earlier, that these costs are getting higher and they are going to continue to get higher. So we need to remember that they're not going to get less. They're actually going to get more expensive. So bringing new people in is not going to be cheap. It's never cheap, but it's going to get more expensive. So we have to know that. I think a lot of leaders, when I talk to them, I think sameness is the enemy of change, as we know, and they're stuck in a mindset of there's always going to be somebody to fill a position. And a lot of leaders have been in positions long enough to where they've seen that be the case, where replacing people was a lot easier to do. That's becoming more challenging from the pool of people. There are a lot of people out there who don't have jobs and a lot of people who don't have qualifications for certain jobs. And so we're seeing a little bit of that with it getting a little bit more narrow. But at the same time, there are a lot of available people who aren't applying and qualified because because of information or research that they've done. So I think the sameness for employers to think that, well, we've been doing it this way for so many years that it's going to just work itself out and people will need jobs and they're going to come back. And that's the part that we have to shift. Those conversations are tough. Getting employers to realize that people think differently, and we have to present a different model and strategy for them to engage with people when they bring them in from beginning until they are, in a place of what I call thriving. And all of that work seems daunting, but it's necessary because that need for people to have all of these things that you're talking about in their sense of purpose isn't going to change. In fact, it's going to get even more important for them. So getting them to get out of their habit of sameness in terms of how they do things is where I think the biggest struggle is and why there's a disconnect in them not necessarily focusing on these numbers.
It's almost like it's just the cost of doing business. I literally feel like I see that over and over again, where a company, especially industries where turnover is typically pretty high. So I
Yeah.
think of an industry like skilled nursing, right? So skilled nursing homes, typical turnover is 40, 45%, if not higher. They just chalk it up to a cost of doing business. And it doesn't have to be that way. You can look in industry after industry and see the outliers that do it differently and actually have significantly less turnover than their competitors when they actually pay attention to it. You've seen that, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I have. And from personal experience of talking to people that are in some very tough jobs that are very demanding, including in the healthcare industry, between doctors and nurses, including my own family members. They will find an avenue that allows them to be more in control of themselves and their lives through that profession rather than a lot of the difficulties that they faced in other positions. And so that turnover, as you're mentioning, gets higher and higher because organizations aren't looking at what can we do to make their experiences in these positions better. And with that lack of connection to the employees and what they need, we're going to continue to see that high turnover rate. And the healthcare industry or healthcare in and of itself is one of those because those can be really tough positions for people to be in.
So, Thomas, one of the things that we didn't have in our list of characteristics, and it may be a miss on our part in terms of just what we didn't list, but employees want to be developed. They
Yeah.
want, I mean, career development has maintained its leadership in terms of why people are leaving. I was just looking at some data today from a competitive company, but they're friends of mine, and they put out an engagement report. And the number one thing that the companies needed to do to engage their employees was development oriented, career oriented growth opportunities. I mean, I know that this is a lot of what you do is going into companies and actually, training and developing employees, but yet so many companies just don't see this as a strategic element to retention and engagement. I don't know why that disconnect exists, but
Hmm.
what do you, I mean, first of all, why do you think employees in this current workforce are so focused on wanting to be developed, wanting to grow? What is it about employees that this is such a focus for them?
Well, it's not just about money anymore. I think people know that there's so many, interestingly enough, there are so many different ways that people can make money these days.
True.
And especially for some people, and it doesn't even matter what their level of expertise is or what they do. There's so many ways that you can find avenues and revenue streams even through social media. So it's not about money per se. It is about purpose and alignment with that purpose for yourself as an individual. Some people know, some people may not know what their purpose is, but they will know what feels good to them in terms of how they are contributing to an organization. So I think people want to, I go back to the word thrive. And for me, thriving is when there is an alignment with what the organization's goals are, the way that you look at positions and how you align people to those positions rather than just putting people in something that they can do. Are they aligned with what they're doing? Does it make sense for them to be using their talent, their intellect, their skill in that position because they see the value in what they're doing? They understand where that value has an impact in the organization and the organization's reach outside of itself. So people are looking for that connection. Very few people that I've talked to from an employee standpoint want to just go in and do a job and go home. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't those people who think that way. There are. However, we're seeing more and more people wanting to have value in what they do, recognition of value. Their purpose matters more than ever, and so they need that individual contribution because it's a balance for well-being. We are inundated with a lot of, I dare I say, negativity in our world through social media, through what's happening just around the world. And people need an escape. And the work that you do can be an escape of positive contribution and value. So if we're going to be doing it for 8, 12 hours a day, depending on what you do in your shift, then you want it to have that feeling for yourself rather than something else that's draining or something that doesn't give you that sense of value and purpose.
So Thomas, you used two words that I want to bring back to career development. You talked about thriving and you talked about value. Don't you also think that when companies are routinely giving employees development opportunities, whether that's training, whether that's, I don't love online training, but giving them access to learning opportunities, don't
Yeah.
you think that that ties into, A, don't you think that makes them feel valued because they feel as though the company's investing in them? They're actually spending money to invest in them. And to your point around purpose and sort of alignment, they they feel as though they're being valued to thrive, and that in sort of indirectly helps to drive that sense of purpose. I mean, maybe I'm not saying that right, but you know where I'm going, I think.
Yeah. Well, I will say that some companies are offering training to individuals, not just in their job, but other trainings that can give them more insights. I think we have to move beyond what I would call generic training. I think
Okay.
a lot of it is generic. And when employees are going through it, they don't see the value in it. They're like, I already know this. I hear that all the time. And I think you and I have even talked about that. It
Yep.
needs to be more authentic and specific and hit the nail on the head with where companies and cultures really are and individuals. So the generic check the box training, employees don't like it because they feel like they're just going through the motions. There's nothing really in it of value for them. If you aren't afraid to let an employee, I say afraid, if you invest in employee becoming the best that they can be for themselves and give them an opportunity to do that through you, the likelihood of them turning that investment back into a turning it back into what they do for you is much higher. And so having that foundation of we want people to be their absolute best for themselves and for us, that two-way street allows you to give them the opportunity for extra training, and then they bring that back to the organization. But being generic and checking the box is where I think you're going, and what I've heard they don't like. I've gotten direct feedback and survey results that have said specifically we get training, but it doesn't really do anything. We already know that.
Yeah, I'm going to give a quick plug for some of the learning and development that we do here at Work Institute, and Thomas helps us with some of this. But we We describe it as facilitated learning, meaning we're coming to the table thinking a lot of the knowledge exists in the room, and we need to get them interacting with each other and learning from each other. And that gives it more of that authenticity. I love that word that you're using, Thomas, because I think one, it's very applicable to their company because they're learning from each other. So the situational components are present there as opposed to some fancy suited consultant coming in and just giving them an example in a hospital when he's training manufacturing companies. And I know that's an extreme example, but I think that's a big part of it. On that note, one of the things that we're seeing, Thomas, is that manager reasons for leaving are on the rise. And this is specifically people saying, I am leaving because of my supervisor, because of the person I work for. We've seen it go from 7% to 9.7% since over the last 5 years. A couple of things going on here that we see is that managers are being asked to do more and more and more. And so much of that is not actually leading their teams. And I think that it's leading to managers questioning their well-being and questioning whether companies are really investing in them. And it's to me, it's just the visual feeling of, well, my most important job should be managing people, and yet I've got less and less time to do that. I mean, how are you feeling? And what you talk to a lot of managers and leaders as well. And by the way, if anybody has a question or just wants to throw a comment out there, please do that in the chat box, not chat bot, the chat box. We'd love to hear from you as we go along. Yeah. So, Thomas, what are you seeing in terms of maybe frustration in actual managers of people right now and the folks that you talk to?
So this is my thing, my niche.
Oh yeah, I know.
What I
you could take. You're probably going to try to take the entire time we have, but let's not do that.
I won't. But working with leaders is where I love the. I say working with leaders is the heartbeat of helping them to understand how to get the best out of employees, because many leaders want to be good people leaders, and even people who have different personality styles are incredible people leaders, but when they're overwhelmed, they can't tap into their strategies or their trainings in order to lead people effectively. And so going back to what you said, there are a couple of things. I think, yes, you're right. There are people who I just had a conversation with a company who is having a hard time getting people wanting to be in managerial positions because of the way that their managers are overwhelmed. And so they have qualified people who are saying no to those positions. So that's happening. And leaders need more specific training when they're put into positions. They may have other qualities that got them into the positions, but not everybody has everything. And expecting them to have it and not giving them the time to train. And here's the thing that I always find really important. Managers need coaching and they need a support structure. One of the things that I do specifically is if I'm training with new managers, I try to train at least 2 or 3 at a time so that they can be in a triad of accountability for each other with the things that they're learning and putting it into practice. They need support as well. So to just pile a lot on them and expect them to get it done, however it gets done, that model does not work. And so managers are they're burned out and they're not able to lead their people effectively, and their people know it. And so the managers might be leaving for the same reasons, and or people are leaving because the manager is in the position, but nothing is changing. So it may not be necessarily that they are leaving because their manager isn't capable of being a good manager. They're just not wanting to wait for that to happen because they can see that there's no strategy in place for that to happen. And employees are speaking up about it. They're speaking up about the fact, I know he's overworked. I know she's overworked. I know they have too much to do and nothing is happening. So I'm going to go somewhere else while you all figure that out.
And one other thing, Thomas, looking back at these characteristics of this emerging workforce and what their preferences and expectations for you for companies are, I also feel like the training and development isn't evolving to address many of these specific things. Do you see some truth in that statement?
Yeah, I think that, equipping managers to lead different kinds of individuals. I think the most important thing is there's this saying, we don't see people for who they are, we see them how we are. And I think that a lot of times managers aren't given that third eye to be able to equip themselves to understand how they need to meet the needs of their team. And a lot of it is learning how to be a coach. Managers also need to learn how to coach. And if they've not been given that skill set or trained on it, then they're missing that opportunity to engage with their team. So getting to meeting them where they are. Everyone needs to be met where they are and then expand from there. And so that's how we're going to be able to truly get to know what people need and be able to understand that how do we align that with the organization's goals and with their purpose. And managers are that important go-between, but they need that skill set they need training on that skill set in order to be able to do it and to do it on a regular basis. So culture fit, I think too, cultures we look for people to walk in a lot of times and fit into our culture rather than understanding what people need in order for them to feel their best with the culture that they already have. There's multiple cultures in an organization, not just one. And we have to break through that barrier as well.
So Thomas, let me try a statement on you because I think what you said is absolutely the case, but I'm going to add one more element. Sometimes we see people and we want them to be something different.
Oh, yeah.
I think this is very much the case with this emerging workforce is that we look at, especially people that are early in their career, and they think they put all the labels on it, right? They're lazy, they're
Mhm.
entitled, they just want the next promotion, all those things, and yet they want them to be different. They want them to be what they think a workforce was 20 years ago. It's not going to happen. We have to
Yeah,
adapt. It's not, they're not changing. This is the
right.
expectations that exist, and they're going to continue to persist. And so we're the ones that have to adapt. Am I wrong in that?
No, yeah, you're not. And I think part of it is finding a different way. You and I talked about this a little bit yesterday to categorize where people are in the workforce. We talked about, generations, and you said we talked about the fact that that can feel like a label. And I think at the end of the day, it's about finding what their expert level is. If they are a legacy expert, maybe, or if they are a digital expert, or if they are innovation, catalyst. I don't know, some other words that we can use. And then that way we can start bridging those gaps between people and their ability and their expert level and having that be the focus rather than it being these other things that we want to use and stereotypes that get in our way for how we can connect with one another.
So, Thomas, one of the things we also talked about in this webcast series was exit and stay interviews are predictive tools to mitigate employee turnover. So, predictive meaning exit interviews are going to predict why people are going to leave in the future. So, we can actually act on that data and we're actually going to reduce turnover. We also see stay interviews as truly giving us an idea of what the risk factors are for people who are leaving. But I don't want to get into the details of exit and stay per se in terms of my question to you, but I think employees just want to be heard. I think they truly want their voice to be heard. I think exits and stays are one way, but I think employee surveys, their annual survey, engagement survey, whatever you want to call it, those are all tools. But I think too many times they still don't feel heard
Mhm.
because we don't communicate back, we don't act on that data, we don't do anything with it. So, do you think there's a sense from employees that they just don't feel like they're being heard?
Yes. And what I will say in my consulting that I talk to organizations about is creating some kind of cadence where there are opportunities for employees to be heard. You have to be intentional. There has to
Mhm.
be some strategy and intentionality around um, hearing the voices of employees. Employee resource groups are great, but if they're not strategized, and I've worked with employee resource groups to give them strategies specifically, lands better. So people are always going to have feelings, emotions, and thoughts. And if we're not tapping into that more regularly, rather than once or twice a year or not at all, except for maybe when they're getting ready to leave, then we're missing opportunities. And so my recommendation is yes, they want to be heard. They want to have a safe way to do it without retaliation and for it to have recognition, not necessarily implementation, but understanding. So, because we can't do everything all the time and not every idea can be done quickly, but it's a recognition of the feelings, thoughts, and emotions that people have about the work that they're doing and how that is given some value or merit and put into consideration for things that can make employee engagement better.
But Thomas, one of the things that we also talked about in our series was the use of favorable ratings in surveys. And again, I don't want to get into the technical aspects of it, but what we talk about around favorable ratings, and again, for those of you that may not have been on that webcast, so typically employee surveys use a 5-point Likert scale. It's like strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. And most companies put strongly agree, agree together to create a favorable rating. And there's very little research to support that that favorable rating is predictive of retention or engagement. So we're actually not holding ourselves to a high enough standard. And I think that would be my question for you, Thomas, is that I simply think companies aren't holding themselves to a high enough standard. They're not expecting themselves to be great, to be excellent. What do you, how do you see that? Well,
Yeah, it's a
it looks
both
like you could
and.
go on for a while on this one, but we don't
Well,
have that much time.
I think I will say what I know, what I've experienced, and what I've heard, and what I've seen in the gaps of employers is they think they're better than they are,
Ah,
and
yes.
and so there is a disconnect between, and there is a truth. Well, let me rephrase that. There is a if I ask to I want to ask it in a way that I get that I get an answer that I like rather than getting what the real facts are, because everybody has a different truth. So there are ways that questions may be asked that aren't necessarily leading to them knowing that they need to do better. And so you're right, getting these favorable ratings that makes them feel good. And then there's yet still surprised when employees are still leaving. So they do have to break this gap between what they want to believe about who they are and the truth of the employee's experience about who they really are. And they have to expand their surveys or expand their uh, not surveys, but so much, but their connection with employees and the safety that employees feel to share. That I'm going back to more strategic, intentional connections with employees, both individual and in maybe small group settings, so that they can get that truth. That's what I think this disconnect is. And so it's a both and so yes, I'm seeing that. I'm definitely seeing that happening with employers.
So the last thing I want to touch on, Thomas, and we just talked about this with Green Baskin last week. It was a great conversation with her. Remote and hybrid work is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. Even though we hear some of the big companies, the Amazons, the Facebooks, Google, some of those saying, back to work, back to office, I should say, back to the office. There's some version of remote and hybrid work. It's just gonna not going anywhere. So
Yeah.
why do you think that this is such a big desire for this emerging workforce? Why is it that this is so high on their list of requirements in the workplace at this point?
Yeah, because I think that people, well, let's be very clear. When we first moved into, work from home with COVID, people were very apprehensive about productivity and people's ability to stay focused, or what are they really doing at home, because we couldn't see them. And for a lot of people, they actually ended up, well, we saw productivity and a lot of and actual intentional engagement went up because it was intentional. So I think we have to look at the long-term game rather than short-term, because right now I think we're focused on the short term and trying to get people back into buildings. So people want that, well, people need the ability to be there. I want to make this easy. Some people's personalities have changed, and being in the work environment has become more difficult for them. Whereas when they were at home, they were able to be more comfortable with their own personality idiosyncrasies and do the best work that they could on their own time. Now they're being put back into a fishbowl and they don't like it. And so that is where that drive to be able to work from home for some people, and that hybrid is necessity, because their personality lends for itself for them to do their best work when they're not under a microscope and don't have to overly engage all the time in what I would call unnecessary ways. People are trying to force water cooler conversations when employees are like, I don't care to have a water cooler conversation. So we're not matching personality types and purpose with people's ability to do their best work. So that flexibility for work from home, hybrid, is going to become more of a need, because COVID made us a little bit more in, into our own energy to do our best work. And being forced out of that has been very uncomfortable for a lot of people and their home life. Their caregivers, they're taking care of their kids or extended family members, and the flexibility to do that while they were at home being taken away is also something that we have to look at and understand. So there's a multitude of reasons, but I think if we don't allow that to happen, we're going to be missing a lot of great employees who need that in order to do their best work, and they can.
So Thomas, we're going to have to wrap up here. I just real quickly for the audience, there were a couple of truths that we actually explored in our retention report that we didn't do in our webcast. I would invite you to download our retention report. You can just go to workinstitute.com, go to the resources page, and there's a retention report tab there. Compliance issues are on the rise. This is a concern. I think it's a little bit of both. I think there are problems in the workplace, but I also think employees are simply more willing to speak up about them. First year turnover is not going down. It's still a persistent problem. It's actually the costliest turnover because we don't get the same ROI from somebody when they leave in that first year. These health and family concerns that I talked about earlier cannot be ignored, and we've got to deal with well-being, and we've got to deal with mental health. And pay is not the problem. It just simply isn't. Pay is not going to be the solution to retain employees. So Thomas, I want to give you the last word. If you were going to sort of, and I know you've attended some of these webcasts, but if you were going to sort of summarize what you've learned and kind of what you see from both our retention report, what we talk about from an emerging workforce, what do employers need to do? What is the thing that they need to be working towards right now?
I would go back to breaking out of the idea of sameness. And even when we think we're being creative and innovative, sometimes we're using the same approach. So I think breaking sameness in order to connect, looking at what it is that you're missing, looking at your gaps. Where do you have your largest gaps? I think leaders need better training on how to be leaders, but they also need support and coaching, and they need to be taught how to coach. And I think employees need to have more opportunity to share their thoughts, their opinions, their expertise, their what they experience on a more regular basis with their leaders and their managers and with the organization. Having a alignment in these opportunities as leaders to one-on-one connect with their teams will help them understand what their team needs individually, and then look at the organization and say, how can we meet these needs for our operational goals and for the profitability of the company? So those are the largest gaps that I'm seeing, and it's going to be uncomfortable, and it's going to take a while to unravel some of the sameness that they have in place. That's where the investments have to be made. So getting more information, having more connection with your team, and giving the leaders the support, the true support, and the coaching and the training that they need for the sustainability of it.
Wow, I couldn't agree with you more, Thomas. So, well, thank you, everybody. We want to wrap up. I really appreciate everybody joining today's webcast. Hopefully, you've joined a few more along the way, and you've enjoyed what you've been hearing and what you've been learning. I really think that Work Institute can help in that area of how do you do things differently? How do you look at things differently? Whether that's with work that we do, we can bring Thomas along. If you like what you heard from Thomas, we can certainly introduce you to him directly and have you talk to him as well. So, but I really appreciate it, Thomas. Our conversations are only to be continued, and maybe we'll let more folks in on some of those conversations down the road. So, thanks for doing this today.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate it, buddy.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you.
All
It's
right.
great to be here.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.